They say if you walk through the old Wainwright plantation under a blood moon, you can still hear the sound of chains dragging through the cotton. Some folks claim they've seen a pale figure standing out there in the fields, silent, watching, waiting. But this isn't just a ghost story. It's a piece of our history buried deep in Georgia's red clay. The story of a man named Ezekiel who vanished at midnight and came back with his master's blood. The year was 1849, deep in the red. Clay heart of Georgia, where the sun beat down like punishment, and the air carried the smell of sweat, iron, and sorrow. The Wainwright plantation stretched wide across that land, a sea of white cotton under a blue, merciless sky. From a distance, it looked peaceful, but anyone who had worked those fields knew better. The beauty was only skin deep. Underneath it lived pain. The man who ruled that land, Silas Wainwright, was the kind who wore the Bible in one hand and the whip in the other. Folks said he prayed before every meal, but everyone on that plantation knew his real prayer was for power, the kind that let him sleep easy while others suffered in silence. Among the men and women bent beneath the sun was a young slave named Ezekiel, but Ezekiel wasn't like the rest. His skin was pale as milk, almost ghost-white, and his eyes were a strange gray, calm and steady. Some whispered he was cursed. Others said he was touched by God himself. Nobody really knew, and Ezekiel never said. He worked quietly, head down, never raising his voice, never fighting back. But there was something about him that unsettled people, even Silas. The master would look at him sometimes and frown, as if Ezekiel's face reminded him of something he didn't want to remember. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was fear. Jonas Pike, the overseer, made Ezekiel his favorite target. "Look at you," Jonas would sneer, cracking his whip across Ezekiel's back. "You think that white skin makes you better? You ain't nothing but God's mistake." Ezekiel never fought back. He never begged. He'd just look up at Jonas with those calm eyes, the kind that saw too much, and quietly go back to work. Each morning, Ezekiel rose before the sun. The rooster would crow, and he'd already be in the fields, his feet damp with dew, his hands raw from yesterday's labor. He'd stop for a moment at the edge of the rows, close his eyes, and breathe in the cool air. Some nights, folks said they saw him staring out across the fields long after dark, like he was listening for something only he could hear. His mother, Hannah, had died 2 winters earlier, working the same land. The old one said Ezekiel hadn't spoken her name since the day they buried her under a crooked pine near the swamp. But sometimes, when the night was quiet, you could hear him humming one of her songs, a low, mournful tune that hung in the air like a prayer that never reached heaven. Silas Wainwright liked to remind everyone who held the power. One scorching afternoon, he rode his horse out to the fields, watching a line of workers bend and move like a single body. When his gaze fell on Ezekiel, something twisted inside him. Anger, disgust, maybe fear. He pulled his horse to a stop. "You think that skin makes you closer to me, boy?" he said. Ezekiel didn't answer. The whip cracked once, slicing the air and his back at the same time. Then again, and again. The sound echoed through the fields until even the wind went still. When it was over, Ezekiel fell to his knees, his shirt torn, his skin bleeding. He lifted his head slowly, his voice calm but steady. "The Lord sees what man hides." Silas froze. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then he turned away, muttering, and rode off. That night, Ezekiel sat alone outside his cabin. The sky was wide and full of stars, the moon hanging low and red. He stared across the cotton rows, his breath slow, his eyes distant. Something deep inside him had shifted, something quiet but unstoppable. The wind passed over the fields, and for the first time, it felt like the land itself was listening. Sunday mornings on the Wainwright plantation always felt strange. The air went still. The tools lay quiet. Even the birds stopped singing for a while. That was the day Silas Wainwright liked to play preacher. He'd stand on the front porch in his fine white suit, Bible in one hand, coffee in the other, and preach to the same men and women he'd whipped the day before. "Obey your masters," he'd read aloud, his voice booming across the fields. "For this is pleasing unto the Lord." Every time he said it, he'd glance down at them tired, sunburned, trembling. And every time Ezekiel stood near the back, hat in hand, eyes lowered, listening in silence. But he wasn't listening for God's voice. He'd stopped believing that God lived anywhere near that house a long time ago. Silas's wife, Margaret, would sit behind him in her rocking chair, quiet, fanning herself slowly. She never said a word. But sometimes her gaze would linger on Ezekiel. People whispered that when she looked at him, she saw the truth she tried to forget. Her husband's sin carved into that pale young man's skin, because everyone knew. They might not say it out loud, but they knew why Ezekiel's skin was white. Ezekiel's mother, Hannah, had once been Silas's favorite field hand, gentle, loyal, strong. She'd raised Silas's children alongside her own, but Silas's kindness had limits. When she grew too old to please him, she went back to the fields. And one blistering afternoon, under a burning sun, Hannah collapsed right there in the cotton rows. Silas rode up on his horse, furious. "Get her up," he shouted. Ezekiel ran to her side. "She can't, sir," he said softly. "She's too weak." Silas dismounted, his face red with anger. "She get up, or she rot where she falls." He grabbed the whip from Jonas Pike's hand and lashed her himself, once, twice, 3 times. The sound echoed through the fields. The others turned their eyes away. When he was done, he dropped the whip and rode off, leaving her there. Ezekiel stayed beside her, cradling her in his arms as the sun sank low. She smiled faintly, touching his face with trembling fingers. "Don't let the hate eat you, my boy," she whispered. "The Lord's justice don't sleep." Then her hand went still. They buried her by the swamp that night, under a crooked pine tree. No marker, no prayer. Just Ezekiel sitting in the dark until morning, his mother's hymn on his lips. After that, something in him changed. He didn't talk much anymore, but the light in his eyes was different. Not gone, just colder, stronger. Silas started to notice. Once, while riding past, he caught Ezekiel staring at him, calm, quiet, unafraid. It made Silas's stomach twist. "You look at me like you see the devil himself," he snapped. Ezekiel didn't answer. He just went back to picking cotton dot. From that day on, Silas kept him isolated, sending him to the farthest corner of the fields, to the swampy patches, where the snakes slid through the water and the air felt thick enough to choke. "He belongs where God don't look," Silas muttered, but the slaves began to whisper. They said the land itself was turning on Silas. The cotton near the swamp had started to die. The wells ran dry. And at night, some claimed they saw a pale figure moving through the mist, humming a song only Hannah used to sing. Jonas Pike swore it was just the wind. But Silas didn't sleep easy after that. He'd pace the house at night, muttering prayers, clutching his Bible like a shield. Margaret asked him what was wrong. He just said one word, "Eyes." And outside, under the crooked pine, the wind stirred. Maybe it was only the trees. Or maybe it was the sound of something waking up. By late summer, the plantation felt different. The air was heavy, thick enough to choke. The fields cracked under the sun, and the river near the swamp had shrunk to a muddy trickle. Even the sky looked tired, but Ezekiel, he moved through it like he belonged to another season. He worked steady and quiet, never rushing, never resting long. The others said it was strange how he didn't sweat like the rest of them. The heat seemed to leave him alone, like it knew he'd already endured worse. His pale skin made him stand out against the cotton rows, almost blending with the very thing he picked. When he lifted his head, his gray eyes caught the light in a way that made folks uneasy. They were calm, too calm, eyes that didn't blink when a man raised his hand or shouted his name. Eyes that had seen too much and were still seeing more at night when the work was done. The others would gather around their small fires outside the quarters, whispering about him. Old Moses, the elder of the group, would shake his head and say, "That boy's got a mark on him." Not the devil's mark, no. Something older, something holy and hard. The younger ones didn't know what to believe. One woman swore Ezekiel could sense when death was coming, that he stopped picking cotton one afternoon and said quietly, "There'll be morning by nightfall." That evening, a mule dropped dead in its tracks. Some said he could speak to the wind. Others claimed his shadow didn't move like it should. But no matter what people said, no one dared mock him anymore. Not after what happened to his mother. Jonas Pike, though, couldn't let it go. He'd find excuses to corner Ezekiel in the fields, trying to break that quiet calm. "You think you're better than me, ghost boy?" He'd say. "You think that skin makes you closer to heaven?" Ezekiel would look at him and answer softly, "I'm close to what's coming." That answer always chilled Jonas in ways he couldn't explain. Even Silas started to feel it. He'd watch Ezekiel from the porch, the way the boy moved slow and deliberate, the way the wind seemed to hush when he passed. One afternoon, Silas saw something that made his breath hitch. Ezekiel was kneeling in the far field, his hands pressed into the dirt. The cotton plants around him, dry, brittle, dying, looked different in the sunlight, almost alive. Their stalks stood straighter, their leaves trembling faintly, though the air was still. When Silas blinked, it was gone. But he couldn't shake it. That night, while Margaret read by lamplight, Silas said quietly, "He's not natural." She looked up tired. "No," she said, "but neither are you." The house grew colder after that. The nights felt longer. Some of the slaves said they could hear humming drifting from the swamp. Hannah's old hymn, the one she used to sing before dawn. Only now it sounded different, sadder, stronger. One evening, lightning flashed far away beyond the trees, but no thunder followed. Ezekiel stood at his cabin door, watching the horizon, the pale light painting his face. The wind brushed through his hair, and he whispered a single word under his breath, "Soon." And from that moment on, everyone, Silas, Jonas, the field hands, even the earth itself, felt that something was coming. Something the South would never forget. The night Ezekiel disappeared, the sky itself felt uneasy. The wind had gone still, and the air hung heavy, thick with the smell of rain and dirt. Far off, thunder rumbled like something waking up in the heavens. The older slaves looked up at the clouds and crossed themselves. They'd seen storms before, but not one that felt like this. By dusk, lightning flashed across the fields, splitting the sky open in jagged streaks of white. The ground trembled with every roar. The slaves huddled inside their quarters, praying under their breath. But one voice was missing from those whispers. Ezekiel's. That same evening, Silas Wainwright had been drinking more than usual. He sat on his porch, watching the storm roll in, muttering to himself. He swore he saw something pale move down by the oak tree, a flicker of white against the dark field. He blinked, and it was gone. Still, his hand shook as he poured another drink. Inside the barn, the air smelled of sweat and iron. Jonas Pike stood there with a lantern, the light flickering across his face. Ezekiel was chained to a post, wrists bleeding where the iron bit into his skin. Jonas spat on the ground. "You been working slow again, boy," he said, his voice tight. Maybe that ghost-looking face of yours finally caught up with you." Ezekiel didn't answer. He kept his eyes on the dirt, calm as ever. "Look at me when I'm talking to you," Jonas shouted, grabbing Ezekiel by the chin. Ezekiel's eyes lifted, gray and steady. "You can chain a man's hands," he said softly, "but you can't chain the storm." Jonas frowned. "What did you say?" But before Ezekiel could repeat it, thunder crashed, so loud it made the barn shake. The lantern flickered, then went out in the flash of lightning that followed. Jonas thought he saw Ezekiel smile. Then came a sound, metal groaning, snapping. The smell of iron filled the air, and the next lightning strike lit the barn for just a heartbeat. Ezekiel was gone. The chains lay empty on the floor, split open as if the metal itself had given up. Jonas stumbled back, heart racing, calling out into the darkness. "Ezekiel, boy, you hear me?" The rain came pouring down, drumming against the roof, the wind howling through the open door. He ran outside, slipping in the mud, shouting into the night. All he saw was the swamp glowing faintly under the lightning, and a trail of footprints leading straight into it. By morning, they sent search parties. Silas rode at the front, his face drawn and pale. The dogs barked and pulled at the scent until they reached the edge of the swamp, and then they stopped. Every single one of them sat down and refused to move. The men found nothing. No body, no blood. Only Ezekiel's torn shirt snagged on a cypress branch, fluttering like a ghost in the wind. Silas spat into the mud. "He's gone," he said flatly. "The swamp took him." But nobody believed that. Not really. That night, the rain stopped, but the air stayed heavy. The quarters were silent, too silent. Then sometime before dawn, the slaves heard something drift through the stillness. Low humming, soft, familiar. Hannah's hymn dotted out near the swamp, where the water reflected the moonlight like silver glass. Something pale moved between the trees, slow, graceful, unbound. Ezekiel was gone. But his story had just begun. The days after Ezekiel vanished were quieter than death itself. The laughter of the overseers faded, the singing in the fields stopped, and the plantation, once full of sound, felt hollow. It was as if the world had taken a deep breath and refused to let it go at first. Silas told himself it was nonsense. "The boy drowned," he said. "It's over." But the land didn't agree. The cotton began to rot before harvest. The buds turned gray and heavy, sagging under their own weight. The smell changed too, sweet at first, then sour, like something dying slow. The workers whispered that the earth had gone bad, that Ezekiel's spirit had seeped into the soil. Silas ignored them at first. He blamed the weather, the rain, the laziness of his hands. But soon, even the air inside his house began to feel wrong. The dogs, his loyal hounds, wouldn't go near the barn anymore. They'd whine and bark at nothing, staring into the empty stalls with tails tucked between their legs. The horses kicked their stalls whenever Silas walked by. Eyes wide and rolling white Jonas Pike, who'd once strutted across the fields with a whip in hand, started drinking heavy. His eyes darted at every sound. He swore he heard something moving in the dark, humming soft and low. "I heard him," Jonas whispered to Silas one morning. "That boy, singing Hannah's hymn, out by the swamp. I swear on my soul I did." Silas slapped him hard across the face. "You'll keep your tongue, or I'll cut it out myself." But that night, even Silas couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rain tapping against the window. Then, tap, tap, came a different sound, slow, steady. From the hall, he sat up. The house was dark, except for the faint glow of a dying fire. He stepped into the hall, barefoot, the wooden floor cold beneath him. "Jonas?" he called softly. No answer. Then came a sound like chains dragging, metal scraping across wood. His heart pounded in his chest. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice breaking. No answer. Just that soft dragging, moving closer, then stopping. He raised his lantern with shaking hands and looked toward the front door. On the wood, something was scratched into the surface. Deep, uneven letters. "You took my mother. I take your blood." Silas stumbled backward, the lantern shaking. "Margaret!" he shouted. "Come quick." She came running from the bedroom, eyes wide. "What is it?" He pointed. But when she looked, the carving was gone. The door was clean, smooth, untouched. She stared at him, voice trembling. "Silas." "There's nothing there." He just stood there breathing hard, his eyes glassy. The next morning, none of the slaves showed up in the fields. They stood outside their quarters, murmuring prayers. When Silas rode out, shotgun in hand, to drive them back to work, the air grew heavy again. The sky dimmed, though the sun was shining. He shouted until his voice cracked. Then, without warning, a murder of black crows burst from the trees, shrieking so loud it drowned out every word. His horse reared, throwing him to the ground. The slaves scattered, terrified. Silas limped back to the house, covered in dust, his pride bleeding. Margaret met him on the steps, her face white as a sheet. "The mirror in the parlor," she whispered. "It fogged over by itself. And when I wiped it clean," her voice broke. "I saw him, Silas, standing behind me. That night, the wind howled through the shutters, though every window was shut tight. The fire wouldn't burn right. The smoke kept curling backward into the room. Silas sat alone in his study, Bible open in trembling hands. But the verses wouldn't bring him peace anymore, because now he knew. The storm wasn't outside anymore. It was inside him, and it had Ezekiel's eyes. The night it happened wasn't a night of thunder or rain. No lightning, no wind, just stillness. The kind of stillness that makes a man feel watched. The moon hung low and swollen, painting the field silver. The cotton looked like snow in the dark. Everything was quiet, but underneath that quiet, something waited inside the big house. Silas Wainwright sat in his study. The fire had burned down to glowing coals, and his Bible lay open on the desk, unread. His hands shook as he poured another drink, spilling whiskey on the pages. He mumbled the same line over and over. "Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord." But in his heart, Silas knew the Lord wasn't the one coming tonight. Then came the sound. Faint, slow, metal dragging across wood. C-H-H-H, C-H-H, C-H-H, he froze. "Jonas?" he called. "That you?" No answer, only the soft echo of chains. He stood, candle trembling in his hand, and stepped into the hall. Shadows clung to the corners like cobwebs. The smell of damp earth drifted through the air-wet soil, even though it hadn't rained for days. "Who's out there?" Silas shouted, his voice too loud for the quiet house. Then came a sound he hadn't heard in months, a low humming. A tune that slid beneath his ribs like a blade. Hannah's hymn, his breath caught. "No," he whispered. "No, Lord. Please, no." The humming grew louder, coming from the porch. He followed it, every step slower than the last. When he opened the door, the night air hit him cold and clean. There, at the edge of the field, stood a figure, still as stone, pale as the moon itself. Ezekiel. The name came out like a prayer and a curse all at once. The figure moved closer, barefoot on the dirt. The moonlight caught his eyes, gray and soft, but burning from within. Around his neck hung a broken chain, rusted and dripping dark. "You're dead," Silas stammered. "You drowned." Ezekiel's voice was calm, almost gentle. You saw what you wanted to see. Silas backed away, shaking. You ain't real. You ain't. Ezekiel took another step forward. You killed my mother in the name of God. You called it mercy. Now the land wants truth. The candle flickered and died. Only moonlight remained. Silas lifted his shotgun, the barrel trembling. Stay back, boy. Ezekiel's face didn't change. You can't kill what the earth already claimed. Stay back. Silas pulled the trigger. The blast ripped through the night. Smoke filled the doorway, thick and bitter. When it cleared, Ezekiel still stood there, dash untouched, but the gun fell from Silas's hands. His legs gave out. Lord, help me, he whispered. Ezekiel's voice softened, but the words felt heavier than the wind. The Lord done watched long enough. He stepped forward, slow and certain. The chains on the floor began to move. Dragging behind him like a second heartbeat, Silas stumbled backward into the house, knocking over a chair. He could hear the chains scraping closer, closer. The fire in the hearth roared to life on its own, flames leaping high. Throwing wild shadows across the walls, faces began to form in the smoke hennas. The ones Silas had beaten, the men he'd buried without names. Their eyes glowed like embers. Silas fell to his knees, shaking. Please, I'm sorry. I was wrong. Please. Ezekiel looked down at him, those gray eyes full of something that wasn't hate. It was justice. Cold and clean. You begged no one mercy, he said quietly. But I'll give you peace. The firelight flickered once. Then silence. When morning came, the house stood still. The front door was open, the air heavy and sweet with the scent of burned wood and something like iron. They found Silas lying in the cotton rows behind the porch, his throat cut clean by his own whip. His eyes stared wide at the sky, the handle of the Bible pressed against his chest. The cotton around him wasn't white anymore. It glistened red in the sunlight. Jonas Pike was the first to see it. He dropped to his knees, whispering, God help us all. And though the sun shone bright, the field stayed cold. From that day forward, nothing ever grew right there again. The soil stayed damp, even in summer. Travelers who passed by at night swore they saw a pale figure standing among the ruined stalks, humming soft and low, as if finishing an old hymn that never ended. Ezekiel had returned, not for revenge, but for remembrance. Morning came soft and gray over the Wainwright plantation. The mist rolled low across the fields, and the air smelled of iron and smoke. By the time the sun broke the horizon, Silas Wainwright was dead, and the land seemed to know it. No rooster crowed. No dogs barked. Even the wind stayed quiet. His body lay out in the cotton rows for half the day before anyone dared to move it. His wife, Margaret, just stood on the porch, pale, frozen, a Bible still open in her shaking hands. When the sheriff from town finally arrived, he took one look and said under his breath, Whatever did this wasn't human. Word spread fast, first among the slaves who remained, then downriver. By sundown, every farm in Telfire County was whispering about Ezekiel, the pale slave who vanished into the swamp and came back for blood. Each person told it a little differently. Some said he returned as a ghost. Others swore he was alive, that he'd learned the swamp's secrets, moving through mud and shadow like a spirit of the land. But no matter how the story changed, everyone agreed on one thing. Ezekiel had come back for justice. The plantation fell apart after that. The slaves left one by one, slipping away in the night, heading north or wherever freedom would take them. The few who stayed behind said strange things began to happen. The cotton wouldn't grow right. The buds came up pale, silver instead of white, and when the wind blew, they rustled like whispers. At night, from the edge of the swamp, you could hear a man humming, soft slow, familiar. Hannah's hymn. One old man named Moses swore he saw a figure standing in the fields one night. Tall, barefoot, eyes glowing faintly in the moonlight. He ain't restless, Moses told the others. He's guardin' what's his. Years passed. The big house rotted away. The roof caved in, the shutters fell, and vines swallowed the porch. Travelers passing by would stop and stare, saying they felt the air grow colder near the fence line. A few claimed they saw someone walking in the fields, pale and silent, when the moon turned red dot by the time the war came and went. Folks had stopped calling it the Wainwright Plantation. They called it the Ghost Field. Parents used Ezekiel's name to hush their children. Behave, or the ghost of the white field will come for you. But for others, especially those who'd once been bound by chains, Ezekiel wasn't a ghost to fear. He was something else. A reminder that the earth itself remembers, that justice might come slow, but it always comes dot in churchyards and campfires. They'd tell his story. About the boy who vanished at midnight and came back not with hatred, but with the strength of every soul that ever suffered before him. And as the decades passed, his name faded from the books, but not from the wind. Even now, when the moon rises over those quiet Georgia fields, old folks still whisper his name. Ezekiel, the ghost who bled his master white, and taught the South that not all hauntings come from hell. Some are born from truth. God, it was nearly 90 years later. In the spring of 1937, when a quiet man named Dr. Samuel Rourke came looking for the truth. He wasn't the kind of historian who chased glory. He chased ghosts, not the kind that rattled chains, but the kind that lived inside old paper, faded ink, and forgotten names. He'd read about Ezekiel in a single sentence. Tucked deep inside an archive in Atlanta, October 12, 1849, Ezekiel missing. Silas restless. That word, restless, wouldn't leave him alone. Rourke followed a dusty map south through the back roads of Georgia until the red clay stained his shoes. When he finally reached what was once the Wainwright Plantation, there was almost nothing left. Just a collapsed chimney, a tangle of weeds, and a field that refused to die. The air was still there, thick, strange, and heavy. Even after all those years, the place felt awake. Rourke stepped through the ruins with a notebook in hand, brushing away vines and broken wood. Underneath the debris, he found part of a doorframe, blackened, half-rotted. When he ran his hand across it, his fingers stopped on something carved deep into the grain. The word was barely visible, but he could feel it under his skin. Blood. He shivered. Maybe it was just a trick of light. Maybe not. That evening, he stayed in a small boarding house on the edge of town. The owner, an old woman named Miss Clara Mayfield, brought him coffee and asked what brought him down this far. "I'm studying a plantation that used to be here," he said. "Wainwright. You ever hear of it?" Her eyes went still. "You mean the Ghost Field?" She sat down slowly, her voice soft as wind through dry grass. "My grandmother used to work there. Said her mama saw the pale man walking through the cotton the night the master died. Said the plants turned red 'cause the earth was thirsty for justice." Rourke hesitated, pen hovering. "And you believe that?" Clara smiled, faint and knowing. "Son, belief don't matter. The land remembers what we forget." He didn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard humming, low, steady, like a song carried on the wind dot the next morning. Rourke went back one last time. He stood in the middle of the field, the sun rising gold over the horizon, and the soil beneath his feet warm like a heartbeat. For a moment, he thought he saw someone standing at the far edge of the cotton, a tall figure, pale and still. He blinked, and it was gone. When he returned to Atlanta, he wrote a note in his journal, tucked between the pages of his research. It was just one line. The ghost field is not haunted. It's alive. And after that, Dr. Samuel Rourke never spoke of Ezekiel again. They say time buries everything. But some things, the earth won't let go. The story of Ezekiel isn't just a ghost tale whispered on southern porches. It's something deeper, a wound, a memory, a truth that still breathes under the Georgia clay. He wasn't just a man who vanished into the swamp or came back for revenge. He was a reminder that even in a world built on cruelty, justice can find its own way home. Sometimes slow, sometimes quiet, but always certain. No preacher wrote his name in any Bible, and no town ever raised a monument for him. Yet his story survived longer than all their sermons. It lived in the voices of the people who told it, passed down by grandmothers who whispered it by the fire, by field workers who hummed Hannah's hymn under their breath when no one was listening. They say if you stand in that field on a still night, when the moon turns red, you might hear him, a soft humming, the sound of chains moving through the wind, not angry, not vengeful, just steady, watching, waiting. Maybe Ezekiel's ghost isn't a ghost at all. Maybe he's the memory of every soul that ever fought to be free, the proof that even in the darkest places, the spirit of justice doesn't die. And so, if you ever drive past those quiet Georgia fields and see the cotton glowing silver in the moonlight, don't look away. Just whisper, "Thank you," because some stories never fade. Some names never rest. And somewhere out there, Ezekiel still walks, not in anger, but in remembrance.